Hi there. Today we are talking about how to use the Pythagorean theorem to find missing lengths of right triangles. So first I kind of want to explain what the missing lengths are labeled as. You can see here I have a right triangle with some angle measures. Our Pythagorean theorem formula is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So let's explain what a, b, and c are. A and b are both the legs of the right triangle. So the legs of the triangle are, let me go ahead and use a different color, this and this. The reason I know that those are the legs is because the other part, the longest part of the right triangle, is called the hypotenuse, and that is C. So you can recognize the legs by knowing that those are the other two sides and they are not the longest part. C is the hypotenuse, and that will be the longest part of the right triangle. Okay, so now that we've kind of identified our parts, let's go ahead and let me erase some of this. There we go. Let's go ahead and plug in the numbers that we have into our formula. So a squared. Now a could either be 9 or 12. It doesn't really matter which one you label as a or which one you label as b. So I'm just going to call 9a. So this is 9 squared plus b is in this case is going to be 12 squared equals c squared. So remember c represents the hypotenuse, which is the longest part of the triangle. 9 squared is 81 plus, and then 12 squared is 144 equals c squared. Now for my next step, what I need to do is I need to add 81 plus 144, and that equals 225, and it still equals c squared. So I want to find out what c is, not c squared. So that means I need to find the square root of c and the square root of 225. So remember, square roots are the opposite of exponents. So if you have something to the second power, the opposite of that would be the root or the square root of that. So the square root of c squared is c, because c squared is c times c. So that means the square root of that is c. The square root of 225 ends up being 15. Okay, and if you weren't sure how I got those numbers, where I found the square root, see some of my other videos about finding the square root. So basically 15 equals C. So that means the length of the hypotenuse in this right triangle is going to be 15. So here is our next example. We are going to find the length of the hypotenuse on this right triangle. This right triangle has leg lengths of 6. So we need to find out what the hypotenuse is, or the longest portion of the right triangle. So I'm going to go ahead and substitute in my numbers. I'm going to substitute in 6 for A plus 6 squared for B. Now, again, it really doesn't matter which one, and especially in this one, which one is A and which one is B, because they're both the same number. Equals C squared. Okay, so 6 squared is 36 plus 36 equals C squared. So my next step is to do 36 plus 36, which equals 72, and that equals C squared. So again, I don't want to know what C squared is, I want to know what C is. So to do the opposite of an exponent means I need to do the square root of that. So I'm going to root both of these with the square root. The square root of C squared is C. Now, the square root of 72 is a little bit tougher because it's not a perfect square. So it really depends on what your teacher says, if they want you to use a calculator to figure out the square root of this, or if they want you to write it in radical form. And if you're not sure what any of those mean, to clarify with your teacher what she wants, or he or she wants. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and use a calculator for this. So when I do 72 square root on my calculator, I get a big long decimal. So I'm going to round it to the nearest tenth. That means C is equal to 8.5 when I round it. On the calculator, it says it's 8.485 and then goes on and on and on. So I'm just going to round it to 8.5. So that would be the approximate length of the hypotenuse on this triangle. Okay, here is our next example. We're going to find the hypotenuse on this right triangle given leg lengths of 2.4. So let's go ahead and substitute in our numbers. A is 2.4, and I'm going to make that squared. B is also 2.4 squared equals C squared. So next I need to figure out what 2.4 to the second power is. And again, it depends on your class if you're allowed to use a calculator or if you have to do it by hand. But either way, it should end up being 5.76. And it would be the same for both because it's the same base to the second power, equaling C squared. Okay, so 5.6 plus 5.6 equals 11.52 when I add those together, equaling C squared. So now to find out what C is, I have to do the square root of both of those things on either side of the equation. So I need to do the square root of C squared and the square root of 11.52. Well, the square root of C squared is C. Now I have to take 11.52 and find out the square root of that. So again, it depends on how your instructor wants you to write this in what form. Sometimes they want you to leave it as a square root. Sometimes they want you to write it in radical form. Sometimes they want you to use your calculator and round to the nearest tenth. So that's what I'm going to do. When I did it on my calculator, I got 3.39411 on and on and on. So I am going to round that to the nearest tenth by making it 3.4. So the approximate length of the hypotenuse in this right triangle would be 3.4.